morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sons of Sequoia podcast, broadcasting live from Wheat Ridge, Colorado, the home of the champions. And today is Monday, so we're going to do Movie Monday like we used to do in the past, and we're looking at another technology-focused documentary entitled Coded Bias. How are you this morning?
I'm doing fine. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Coded Bias brings up a lot of good points and a lot of things that we can say about it.
Definitely. I thought that it was a fantastic documentary, much in the vein of documentaries like The Social Dilemma, but different. And I think I'll go so far as to say I may have liked it a bit more than The Social Dilemma. How did you feel when you just flat out compare the two?
I really liked it. She stayed to the theme. She stuck to the objective, followed it through, and had a lot of different perspectives, but really didn't deviate from the main objective of the film. And I thought she did a really good job. Yes. They all did a good job on that. Joy's the main character. She did a good job. The director is Shalini. They all did a great job.
Yes, it's a Shalini Kantayya film, and it premiered at Sundance, and I think that it premiered to a pretty warm reception. I didn't know that they had Sundance in 2020 due to the pandemic, but they did. And this is an example of, I think, and of course it's easy for me to say, but you have a filmmaker who's a woman of color, and the principal character, Joy Buolamwini, I feel bad for butchering her name, Buolamwini, as a woman of color. And so what you get really is these diverse perspectives, these female perspectives. We can take a look. There's no picture of Shalini Kantayya, but here's the cast of, so Joy, the PhD candidate at the MIT Media Lab, and Meredith and Kathy and Silky and Zeynep and Amy and Trinae and Virginia and Isame. And you have to get down to the 9th listed person to get a guy, and it's a man of color. So, I mean, I do think that exposing different voices does give you a different perspective. If it was a bunch of, white software engineers talking about facial recognition, you would have had a different story. And so I do think that these alternative voices are extraordinarily important to have in film. And it's cool that there's people out there that are making them, and it's cool that this documentary was made. It was so well made that it got into Sundance, and I think it's all good.
And I think also the views were very, very well presented, and there were strong arguments. And even though it was from a different perspective, the arguments were very good, and they had very strong, powerful things to say, and it was a good movie. It made everyone think, and actually. I think, let me emphasize everyone, not just people of color.
Yes.
It made everyone think of everything. It doesn't matter. People can be prejudiced all over the place, but they brought it up to the forefront. He says, look, here is exactly what is happening. You can talk about it, but then they demonstrated it. And I think Joy did an excellent job demonstrating how this bias can be so prolific. And yes. We don't even know it.
And I think she was a great protagonist because she had a lot of warmth, a lot of optimism, and she was very, very smart and very competent. But I will start by saying, the movie poster, and we can sort of give away a bit of the movie, has this mask here, and then there's a picture of Joy here with the Jabberwocky-style face mask for those who are listening. There's a dance group called the Jabberwockies, and they wear this type of expressionless white face mask. All the members of the dance troupe do. So for those of you who don't know, so she was experimenting at the MIT Media Lab when she started her PhD thesis. There's a course where you take inspiration from science fiction and you try to make it reality. So she tried to make this mirror that would sort of pump her up, and through software. And so they showed her, she bought a Logitech webcam, and she was trying to use open source face recognition technology, and it couldn't recognize her face. And she's like, what the hell's wrong here? And it didn't recognize her face until she put on a white mask. And that's when she realized that prevailing facial recognition algorithms, they were really good at recognizing white men and really bad at recognizing women of color. Um, and so that realization in that class at MIT early on in her PhD journey changed the trajectory of her life. And so she started to do research down the field of these algorithms. They're made mostly by white dudes, and they're really good at identifying white dudes, but they're really bad at identifying people of color, especially women of color. And as a result, when you deploy them, that bias gets perpetuated. And that's sort of the whole, that's not the whole enchilada, but that's a lot of what the movie's based on. You sort
That's
of,
the beginning. That's
yes.
the beginning. That's the premise. And from that premise, it actually demonstrated it. But then they began to have studies, scientific studies, statistical studies, to show how the percentages did fall out exactly what she found anecdotally from that experiment. Other types of controlled experiments demonstrated the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the hierarchy, statistically significant hierarchy, was 90 to 100%, high 90, 98, 99% accuracy for white men. And it went all the way down to, I think it was like 60 some percent for black women. And then the range was men, women, and then black men and black women. And it was significant.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, and this is not people, these are the algorithms. But then the algorithms are made by people. And what people? And there's where the story started. And I want to say that the story, that when she continued on, began pulling a lot of things in, because she was a PhD candidate, PhD student in computer science. But that goes into analytics too.
Mm-hmm.
What types of analytics were they using? What type of algorithms were they using? And actually, she even started the Algorithmic Justice League to say the biases within algorithms that she began to see, she began to measure, and other people began to demonstrate. And so she has she was the founder of this Algorithmic Justice League, mm-hmm. to say, we need to have accountability within our algorithms in AI, starting with facial recognition. And when I saw that, I'm not in that field deeply. I'm related to that field, and I did a little bit in it, but not much. But my thinking is, yeah, there's facial recognition, but how deep does it go? Mm-hmm. Because AI touches so many things of making decisions that we allow machines to make decisions for us.
Yes.
And machines are not humans. They don't bring that human element in.
And the movie really got into some of the other things that, I mean, facial recognition is scary enough because it's new, but algorithms are already dictating the courses of our lives. And they brought in some stories. I guess I could pull up the cast list again. The story of the teacher, Daniel Santos, middle school
Daniel
teacher.
Santos, yes.
So I believe it was the Houston School District, he had won Teacher of the Year 2 times in 10 years in the whole district. And then he'd won Teacher of the Month. And he'd had commendations, and he'd had performance reviews from his administrators, and he was always above board. They implemented a system that numerically assigned an algorithm to teachers, and he was recommended for removal. And he's like, I've worked hard. I've been a good teacher. I've been recognized as a good teacher by my peers and by my students. And an algorithm comes in and says, you should fire this guy. Against the recommendation of everything, against all. And so he got the union to go to bat for him, which I said at the time is a good argument for unions, to have somebody to go to bat for you, And he didn't get sacked, but that was a small victory. And I guess the filmmaker's point of view was, this is happening in a lot of places with employment, with credit scores, right, with whether or not you get a loan, with whether or not you get a credit card, with whether or not you have access to money or housing or a job. Algorithmically, this is being decided. And that may not be a good thing, because we can't just trust that these algorithms are right. Sometimes the companies that employ these algorithms, that deploy these algorithms, they're opaque. We don't know what the algorithms are doing from the outside, and you don't have any recourse to say, I think the algorithm was wrong. They say, no, we just go by what the algorithm says.
Go back to the cast. Mm-hmm. I should have that. one of the characters was Issa Mae Downs, and she was a Brooklyn resident, right there. And what I really, really liked what she said. Very logical, very straightforward. And Issa Mae, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Issa Mae, Miss Downs, Miss Issa Mae. She said, you know, yeah, these successes are fine, but you can't stop there.
Mm-hmm.
You got to keep going. It's going to keep happening. You got to not stop events. You have to stop the pattern of events. And see, she had such a great insight on what needed to be done. And so they interviewed a lot of good people with good insight and good issues and arguments. There were very strong arguments all the way across the board.
Yeah, I would say, to be honest, there were a couple storylines. There was Joy and her realization that open source facial recognition software was inadequate, and then she took her studies to Microsoft, IBM, Amazon. And the fascinating thing was when she published her study about Amazon's facial recognition program being biased, Amazon's vice president or whatever, he released and says, no, they're off. Their research is wrong. Their research has no merit. That was his response. And there's a scene of her and her research partners reacting to it. And it's like some of the stuff he said was just technically inaccurate, and people just believe this guy because he's a white guy that's a vice president at Amazon. But he's just saying lies or mistruths or falsehoods. And it's frustrating. He's like, well, when you're a woman of color trying to put stuff forward, it's easy for them to discredit you because you don't look like them. And conversely, she said, when I presented this data to IBM, they flew me in, they had me present the data, they got a team together and they replicated the data from my study, and then within 2 months they patched the API and they pulled the numbers up to near parity. So it wasn't like 60% accuracy for women of color, 99% accuracy for white men. It was 99% accuracy for white men, 98% for women of color. And the interesting thing that she says, and her point is extraordinarily well taken, is that the fundamentals didn't change. The technology didn't change. Someone had to point out that it was poor. It did poorly against this subgroup. And without someone on the outside pointing that out, they may have never noticed that and just started deploying that technology. And that's crazy.
It was the way the algorithm was applied. So the math is a math. Actually, Kathy O'Neill was also, she wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction, Kathy O'Neill. And she's a mathematician. And so she says, look, the algorithms do what they do, but when you feed them, when you have program learning and you feed them data, and that data will lead you to a conclusion, that data could be biased, and it is biased.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another talking point in this film, is how the algorithms form their decisions from data, and what data do you use, and who develops the algorithms, and how they put the data together, mm-hmm. and where are they going with it, And so if all your data, we're talking about facial recognition, if all your data come from white men, then the algorithm will identify white men and not identify anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and Kathy said, look, the algorithms do what they do. It's how they're used, and on how they're set up, and how they're used, and how they're programmed. And then also later in the film, they start talking about how is it going to be used. And then they go to Europe, in England, and the way it's used is that, like you were saying, David, they say, well, if the algorithm says this, then that's what we're going to believe. Says, no, it's wrong. And they're starting to believe the machines over human judgment, and that's really, really dangerous.
Yeah, and in Europe, so that's where this lady comes in, Silke Carlo, the director of Big Brother Watch.
Yes.
They're deploying facial recognition systems. They have a 98% false positive. And it's typically I don't know this is the way it was portrayed in the film. I don't know the numbers, but it looked like any black person would ping, oh, this is a criminal, and they take them off to the side. They start asking them questions. They take their fingerprints. They get their ID, and then they let them go because the thing was wrong. But it's like, that doesn't seem right to me, you know? So a machine false positives you, and you have to deal with the police for 20 minutes on your way to work. You lose your job because the police are fingerprinting you while you're supposed to be at work. Like, everything about that seems wrong to me. And so it's no wonder to me why Silky Carlo and her group, the what's it called? Big Brother Watch? Big Brother Watch UK.
Yes.
It's no wonder to me why that group exists, because
That's right.
the current deployment of these facial recognition systems seems onerous. Now, if it's onerous now, what's it going to be like in the future? That's the question. And then the movie takes us all over the globe. It takes us to China, and it sees how it's used. How did you feel about the Chinese portion of the movie?
Well, it I didn't have a different opinion of the Chinese portion. I was really concerned with the UK portion. And the UK portion in Europe, I kept thinking, going back to the UK before we get to China, I kept thinking that, well, you look at the police, and the police say, why are the police doing that? Well, the police are just doing their job. Who told them to do it that way? Let's back up. Yeah, they are doing their job. And I noticed it's anecdotal, but the scene that they had was just young 14-year-old kid was the facial recognition said it was a false positive. He was a criminal, but he wasn't. He let him go. But after a while, so you look at what the police did. Well, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so we have to back up and say, wait a minute, be careful you don't blame the messenger. Who are telling them to do that? And who made the decision that this is how the police are going to act? And so I think the attack needs to be directed toward the source of what is happening here, and not necessarily the propagators. And actually, sometimes they need to stand up and say, wait a minute, I'm doing this, but I see that it's not right. And so if you make that many mistakes, then maybe there's something wrong in the training. There's something wrong in the use of the technology. And they made the point that this is just facial recognition, and that is being used to profile people, or to arrest people, to identify people. But that AI is also used for other things too, and like for jobs, for hiring people or firing people. It can also be used for another part of the film was on voting back in 2016, and how you can identify the psychological. You don't know what these algorithms are doing because they're doing it to individuals. You can't say, oh, this algorithm is looking at this group. No, they're looking at individuals differently. So you're going to look at 20 million different types of issues and say, here's why this is wrong, here's why this is wrong, here's why this is wrong. It's really difficult to look at the results. You have to look at the source, because they were profiling individuals on what will make them make a decision, what will make them vote a certain way. Once they found that, well, then they could go in and move their actions and their decisions the way they wanted to. And that was done on an individual basis, not a group basis. So how it's used was not just facial recognition. It's going deeper and broader, and there has to be controls. Another issue, David, that was brought up is that there is no controls on this. There is no legislation. There is no policing of it. There is no people will identify it. Scientists will say, wait a minute, this is wrong. But there's no legislation. And they did get into the legislation. Joy did.
Yeah, and the interesting thing was that was the Brooklyn housing tenement with Issa Mae Downs and Trinae Moran. They had facial recognition installed instead of key fobs, and they felt like it was extraordinarily intrusive. If there was an altercation in the hallway, they would get an envelope under their door with a picture of them and their apartment next to it. It's like, you were involved in this. Like, that's a strike. And she's like, it seems very Big Brother-esque. I mean, and so they started fighting against this. And there was an interesting one of the authors, and it was a good combination of real life stories, like the Brooklyn Housing Project residents, and authors. I forget which one it was. It may have been Virginia Eubanks, but saying, you typically think that the technology gets deployed and the wealthy get it and the poor get it later. But now this surveillance technology is deployed against lower income people, and only when it's proven viable or once the bugs are ironed out does it get deployed on higher income people. And that's exactly what was happening in the Brooklyn housing project, and they felt like it was invasive. And I'm sure that it was invasive. I'm sure if you lived there, it would feel invasive. And that was a cool subplot with Joy and Trinae and Issa Mae Downs sort of saying, we don't want facial recognition to be used as our key fob here. And they won. In the end, the Brooklyn housing, he said, okay, we'll go back to normal key fobs. But Issa Mae Downs said, hey, listen, that's not enough. We know that facial recognition is being deployed all over the place. We know that machine learning is being done to profile people and that it's disadvantageous to us. We need legislation at the state level and the federal level to make sure that this doesn't happen. And that's when Joy said, yes, we do, but that's a conversation for a different time. I wrote a poem about this victory. She shares her poem. And I think there is some sort of, yes, the fight's not over, and it's important to realize that. But you have to take time to sort of celebrate the small victories along the way. I think that was sort of the message of that part.
I agree. And Miss Issa Mae, you are absolutely right. Miss Issa Mae, I want to say that it was heartwarming to hear your logic, your clear thinking, your logic, your conclusions, and moving forward. But also, Joy was right too. Let's celebrate. Let's come together and say, let's look at where we are.
Yeah.
You have to do both. Celebrate where you are and where you've come in order to strengthen yourself to move to the future. And so maybe the future, maybe they weren't moving to the future as fast enough for Miss Issa Mae, but also they were moving and they were going. And they're going to do it, and you move from strength, and the way you get strong is you celebrate your successes, and bring people together. It was very interesting. It was a very, very good movie, and I think it was 100% on Rotten Tomatoes.
No, it's not. That was the other one that we were going to watch, but
I thought I saw it on this one. What was the percentages then?
Let me go. I'll find it. On Rotten Tomatoes, coded bias.
Yeah, I thought it was that. So what are the percentages?
Oh, you're right. It is 100% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It was 100% on Rotten Tomatoes and 73% in Metacritic. And anyway,
so I will say,
go ahead.
You said you wanted to talk about Britain. I don't know exactly what point you made when I asked you about China, but we have the Chinese lady here, so I do want to talk about this. This is a logical conclusion. So in Britain, they're deploying facial recognition. It's getting false positives. They're using it to harass black people. That's what it looked like to me, and that might just be anecdotal and what they were able to film in the story. They may have cherry-picked a few false positives, but that's what it looked like they were using facial recognition for. In China, we see the logical conclusion of the deployment of facial recognition. You pay with your face. You have to submit your face biometrically to be able to access the internet. Every transaction you do has your face and your identity attached to it in China, and the government gets that information from the big three. Because we have the big five here: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. They have a big three there. They send it all back to the government, and they use that to give you a social credit score. Your social credit score determines what you have access to, what public services you can access. You can't ride buses or trains if your social credit score is too low. So you have to stay in the good graces of the digital Big Brother in order to have access to vital public services. And the girl here, she looks like a Zoomer. She's got blue hair. She's skateboarding around. She says, "Yeah, I pay with my face. It's so convenient, and as long as you don't misbehave, your credit score stays high. So when you meet someone, you can ask them what their credit score is, and if it's too low, you can decide not to be friends with them. And if it's too low, they won't get a job, so they don't have any money. So you got to keep your social credit score high. You always have to behave. You always have to play by the rules of the state, and you can use that to help you guide your decisions. You don't want to be associated with someone with a lower score than you, because that'll lower your score." And so it's basically like taking decision making, interpersonal decision making, out of the hands of the individual and giving it to the state. And that is extraordinarily frightening to me. But it's fascinating to see someone living in it, someone who, this person could be an activist just by the way they look, with the blue hair and the skateboarding. I think that might even be a neck tattoo. We're looking at a picture of her. But she's not an activist. She's in this system. They tell her this is the way the system works, and she's fine with it. Now, from outside the system, we say that's absolutely horrifying. But if you're in it and it's working for you, you're sort of oblivious to it. And it sort of echoes, I think, in a way, the fact that Joy was able to identify a fatal flaw because it happened to her. Whereas the engineers that designed these facial recognition systems, they didn't see that fatal flaw because it didn't happen to them.
Well, to conclude, the argument, a bigger argument here is using machines to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
The antithesis to that is having humans make decisions. Well, machines, as shown in China, they'll say, "Oh, well, you have your social score and everyone walks the line, everyone does the same thing, everything does everything right. And if you do everything right, you have a high score. If you have a high score, then this is exactly the kind of person you should be, and don't deviate from that." But humans deviate from that all the time. And lately, David, we've been watching Hamilton. To bring Hamilton in, Alexander Hamilton didn't fit the mold.
No.
He was not. He would have had a really low social score. And what he did, what our founding fathers did in the United States back in the 1700s, they would have had a really low social score in China.
Mm-hmm, because they were against the crown.
They're totally against everything. But they came together and they created a nation that became one of the strongest nations in the world. And so you say the China approach, what are you trying to do? What's going to be the result of that? If you make everybody the same, if everyone has the same high social score because everyone does everything right, is that good from a human standpoint? Or do you let everybody be individuals? And you'll learn to agree to disagree. You'll learn to come together and work things out. And sometimes controversy can make your position even stronger. And sometimes you modify your position to make it stronger. And is that going to be a human way to do it? And so this clash between artificial intelligence that pushes the machine decision making and human intelligence that pushes human decision making, how will they come together and how will they coexist? And I think that's the bigger issue that this movie was trying to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly the challenge of the future. And the challenge is not just with the scientists. The challenge is going down to the actual legislators, our politicians, to our business people, to our society, to speak up and say, ask questions and say, is this right? Uh, but I guess before we leave, when you do that, you have to talk and you have to listen more than you talk
Mm-hmm.
and try to understand what the other person is saying. You don't just say, here's what I think, and I'm not going to listen to you. And that's kind of what AI does.
It's true. Although the movie does a good job of pointing out the China model, as scary as it is because it's foreign to us, the China model optimizes for control, for state control. And it keeps people in line by virtue of sort of a totalitarian surveillance state. And they say that's scary, but the US model is pretty scary too. The US model exploits the most vulnerable and benefits the least vulnerable by virtue of AI and algorithms that are directed at maximizing wealth for the wealthy and sort of using it by sort of preying on the poor in a predatory way. Whether it's high interest loans, whether it's gambling, substance abuse, the ads get targeted in a way where there's no protection for anyone. Whereas in China, we're protecting the state by putting everyone under wraps. In America, we're not protecting anyone and we're letting AI run amok. So you could say both models are somewhat horrifying if you look at them in the right light.
That's true. That's true. In China, it's political power. In the United States, it's financial power.
But to go back to China, I do want to read a quote from Steve Jobs. It's a famous quote. I'm not a Steve Jobs guy, but this is probably his most famous quote. And like you said, you'll stifle innovation. If you make everyone behave the same way, a lot of the great innovations in human history have come because people sort of bucked the trend. And I think a lot of times, too, people buck the trend and they're wrong. And they get culled from the herd without needing some sort of social credit score. And it allows everyone else to see, oh, those people were wrong, so they lost. But they had some ideas that we can incorporate into the main line of thinking. You know what I mean? But let's get to the Steve Jobs quote. I'll read it real quick, verbatim. Here we go. Steve Jobs, quote, "When you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is and your life is just to live your life inside the world. Try not to bash into the walls too much. Try to have a nice family life. Have fun. Save a little money. That's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact. Everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you, and you can change it. You can influence it. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again."
That is so true.
It's a good quote. I mean, I'm
That's
not
a
the
really
biggest
good
Steve
quote.
Jobs fan, but I think that one's true.
Yeah, that is good. That is good. It'll never be the same once you realize that you have something to contribute, and what you contribute is yours.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what someone tells you to contribute.
The fascinating thing, though, is the social credit score. Yes, there is real consequences for having a low social credit score. But I think that societies have done that in many ways throughout human history. They haven't quantified it algorithmically, but gossip and, someone gets demoted on the social totem pole, they can't have access to certain services within the society. It's been a thing. It's not the first time we've seen this in history. It's the first time we've seen algorithms sorting it out, but someone's reputation and where that leaves them in terms of standing with society, that's been a constant, hasn't it?
Yes, and we have it in the United States too. Just look at the differences of salaries, differences of pay scales, differences of promotions, differences of in business and in the society. We have it everywhere. China has just measured it. They
Yes.
put it in a score.
Well, and then if we go back real quick, one more story before we quit. I think we need to talk about LaTanya Myers. This was sad. So they're talking about parolees.
Hmm.
They'll have algorithmic determination of whether or not you're a risk of recidivism, whether or not you're going to be a criminal again. So Latanya Myers was a criminal. They didn't say what she did. She got parole. She found gainful employment. She volunteered. She was an activist in her community trying to keep kids from going into a life of crime. She'd received 2 commendations from the city council for her volunteer work while maintaining a full-time job. Now, the algorithms that determine, are you going to commit a crime again? One of the heaviest weights is zip code. And they said that's an analog for race. I mean, so she got flagged as a high risk for committing a crime again. And she says, I've been working my butt off for 2 years to be a model parolee, to do everything right. And this computer comes back and says, you're a high risk because of where you live. And I have to go in and meet in person with my parole officer every single week for an hour. And it's like, that's cramping my style. I'm doing things in the world. I'm accomplishing these things. And I tell my parole officer, you know me. I've done all this stuff. And you know that this 1 hour a week that I have to come in and meet with you instead of checking in by phone is keeping me from doing good in the community. And the parole officer said, yeah, I know, but there's nothing I could do about it. The algorithm says you're high risk. And that seems off, right? And so
Right.
it's like, don't say it can't happen here. It is happening here. It's just, I guess the point of the whole movie and the point of Joy discovering that open source facial recognition software is biased against her is one thing. But the way that plays out with Daniel being told he's a bad teacher, with Latanya being told she's going to be a criminal again, that's the end effect of it. And so the movie does a good job of drawing a straight line to Joy sort of noticing something weird with the software because she's in software, to this has real world consequences when you deploy algorithms that aren't really sensible. It can be a harsh miscarriage of justice at that point, and it's happening today. And it's not happening to people like you or me. It's happening to people like Latanya Myers. And that's what's sad. And that's the fascinating thing about, I think, racial injustice or any injustice whatsoever. If you don't experience it personally through lived experience, it's difficult to realize that it's actually there. But if someone does the work to show it to you, like Shalini did in this documentary, Shalini Kantayya, like Joy is doing with her research, like Kathy's doing with her work, you sort of realize this is a real thing. This is a real threat. And this is creating a society that's unfair. And I think that's what's great about this movie, perhaps even more than the social dilemma, is that it really did lean into what's, a female technologist perspective and a female person of color technologist perspective. And then also, how does that play out in stories in the real world, whether it's Daniel Santos or Latanya Myers or the women in the Brooklyn housing projects. I felt like the story that this movie drew was a very clear, logical, thought out line from this happened and it was a little quirky, but what are the implications of this quirky thing happening? And wow, you see it play out in the world, and this discrimination does exist in the world, and you wouldn't know that it existed unless someone told the story, unless it happened to you. If it doesn't happen to you, someone has to tell you the story, and that's what this movie is great for.
Mm-hmm. Well, when Joy began telling the story, then things began to emerge. Stories began to emerge to say, oh, I see what you're saying, and it happened to me. And so now you have all of these stories throughout that it has happened, but then Joy gave a theme of here is what is happening, and then these stories would come and support exactly her thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And it revealed many things. And actually, she also began to address legislation.
Yes.
And and so and they started moving toward changing things with legislation, and they actually gave actually the what was her name, Miss Isame. She also was very adamant about, hey, we need to change the laws. We need to change how things are being done in our
Hmm.
country, and uh, and they were, and they were starting to move in that direction.
Now, yeah, and I do think, state level. Then, and they did show at the end, city of San Francisco, city in Massachusetts or something. The cities start to ban facial recognition
Right.
technology by their police officers, and then you have, people taking it up at the state level. The federal government won't use facial recognition, um, and so there's action on it, but it's not, wholesale. It's not like federal government banned it for use on federal properties or something, not or by federal agencies. But that doesn't mean that the federal government can't deploy it to state bureaus of investigation or local police officers to use it. Um, so it could be in use. There's just an end around. But the fact that what the movie showed was people, and what I liked about Joy a lot is that she was very optimistic. And that maybe not optimistic, but she saw a problem and she confronted it and she got results without really being angry or militant about it. She got results by doing the work, by doing the research, by saying this is wrong, by sort of seeing a future that could exist and pursuing it, and not really by complaining, you know?
By promoting solutions.
Yes.
She got results. Instead of complaining about the problem, she passionately promoted solutions.
Yes. And that's why she was a great person to sort of frame the whole movie around, because I think that I don't know. I can't speak to the lived experience of women of color, but I think that Joy, one of the reasons she was able to get results is because she was determined, but also not off-putting. She was sort of happy-go-lucky, but she's like, hey, yeah, you're totally wrong. I did the research and your algorithm sucks. We did a mathematical analysis and your statistical projections are way out of whack. But it was just matter of fact. It's like, do you care to fix it? And IBM did bring her in and did fix it. And she had a great point. Once IBM brought her in and fixed it, she's like, okay, so now they've brought, parity for women of color and facial recognition. The question is, how are you going to deploy that? That wasn't her goal. Her goal wasn't to have facial recognition recognize women of color as much as white people. It's like, now there's the next step. You're going to use this in the real world. And it's one thing to have the accuracy be there, but if the accuracy is used to discriminate against these people, what was the point of any of this? And so the cause for constant vigilance is implied in that statement.
Yes, even though that was successful, that opens up doors to other problems in the future. So how are you going to use it now? So it was used, it gave biased results.
Mm-hmm.
But now that the bias is taken out, but then ethically, how will you use it? And so it moved from bias to ethical application. So there was a number of things that each person, all the people that talked in this movie, they brought some extremely good points moving forward. And that was the strength of this film, of this documentary. It wasn't just one person. Joy was excellent in what she was saying, but Joy was also good in bringing other voices in. What Kathy O'Neill had to say, it was extremely strong.
Yeah.
And everyone was strong.
And Kathy was in the algorithmic Justice League as well. I thought that was cool.
Yes.
And yeah, so I can't recommend this movie enough. It was fantastic. I thought the characters that they chose, the characters being real people because it's a documentary, were good. The experts, Zeynep Tufekci, Meredith Broussard, Virginia Eubanks, they provided commentary that was interesting. The people working in the field, like Silky Carlo, Ravi Naik, Deborah Raji, Mark Cuden, they were great. And the real life stories of Trinae Morgan, Issa Mae Downs, Kiri Soares and Latanya Myers and Daniel Santos, that also provided incredible context. And I think the combination of the three, just building it around experts that are working, experts that are thinking about it, and then people whose lives are affected by this, made for a great documentary.
Yeah, it was very well done, very well designed, very well produced, very well presented, and very just overall well done.
So I mean, I would recommend it. Would you recommend it?
Absolutely, yes. I agree with 100% evaluate. That actually, what I like probably most about it is that it provides a platform to not sit still. It's a platform to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at it, you say, yeah, something needs to be done, and it's not like something needs to be done in a very responsible way, in a very deliberate, responsible way where change is going to be lasting, and change is going to be positive and good. And that's my takeaway from the film. I really liked it for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. And I liked it because Joy showed you can be an activist, and you can be an activist on issues of vital importance, but you don't have to be angry. She seemed like she had a very good perspective on life, and maybe that's just, who she is, but she was optimistic, and yet she was realistic, and she was getting stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole time it wasn't a tragedy. I mean, it was a tragedy. Like the systemic discrimination of algorithms is tragic. But she said, but we got to work against it. Let's, do a study and show how it's, negatively affecting this community. Now, let's see what we can do to change that. And she's forming the Algorithmic Justice League, and she's getting stuff done. And the vibe I get is hope. It's hope for change, and it's work for change. It's not anger, like self-destructive anger, where it's like, we're going to be so angry that we're never going to accomplish anything. It's, we're going to recognize that there's a problem, and we're going to say, how do we fix this? And I think that's a lesson that anyone can use in any walk of life.
And I think a good lesson, a practical lesson, is that if she was not that way, there's no way that she would go into IBM and they would listen to her and change their algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
That would never happen. And so people today really want to be angry. And if that's true, well, then stop. This movie gives pause to those people. Why are you angry? Do you want to change things? If you want to change things, then stop being angry and try to be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
Just like what Joy did.
Stop being angry and get to work.
Stop being angry, because that's not going to help anybody. It might help you feel good, but it's not gonna solve anything.
Mm-hmm.
Start thinking about solutions and working together. Another aspect in this movie, from a broader view, is because of her personality. Look how many people she brought into this.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just you mentioned a lot of them, but there's a lot more than that. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Legislators, everyone. It's not a problem working with Joy because she is so logical. She's smart, really smart, but she's nice, and she's focused on a solution. And if you can be part of the solution, then come and join me.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter who you are. And if she's almost like the example. She's being an example of what she wants other people to be.
Mm-hmm.
Be like Joy, and work with everyone. It was very interesting.
Yep. And I mean, as one more caveat, she's also taking on the companies that are most likely to hire you with a high six-figure salary or mid six-figure salary out of her program. It's fascinating. I think that a lot of her colleagues are probably employed by these companies that she's saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong. So I think it's fascinating. It requires bravery that you don't really see because of her attitude. But what she's doing is extraordinarily brave, and it's
right.
It's showing a lot of courage, but it sort of gets glossed over because she's got such an affable, attitude. But I think we're running out of time. So all I can say is if you have a chance to see Coded Bias, the 2020 film by Shalini Kantayya. It's available right now for viewing on Netflix if you have a Netflix subscription, and I can't recommend it enough. And I'll roll the outro music.
Okay, I agree too. I recommend this movie. It is strong, and the characters are fantastic. And one thing that they did, as the music plays in our podcast always says at the end, is that one thing this movie did, and one thing that we will encourage people to do, is keep talking and talk and talk, but listen more than you talk and try to understand what the other person is saying.
Goodbye.
Bye.